A 12-year-old cleaner's son was invisible in a billionaire's mansion until he overheard something in French the billionaire didn't understand. What he did next risked his father's job, exposed a dangerous secret, and changed 3 lives forever. Stay until the end, because the real lesson isn't what you think. The billionaire laughed when the cleaner's son said he spoke 3 languages. He mocked the boy until minutes later the kid translated something that revealed a dangerous secret, and that changed everything. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the Luther mansion at precisely 8:15 p.m. But it wasn't an accident. It was the exact moment Samuel Ross realized his son was about to change everything. Before we go further, understand this. Peter's story isn't just about courage. It's about the moment you realize that staying silent costs more than speaking up ever could. What happens next will show you why some risks are worth taking, no matter the price. Keep watching. He had begged God that morning on his knees in their one-room apartment, bone grinding into concrete until the skin went white, hands locked together. "Just today," he whispered into the silence. "Please, just let me get through today without losing this job." There was no one left to help him pray. Samuel had buried his wife 12 years ago due to complications during Peter's birth, and since then, every morning began the same way. Him asking God for one more ordinary day. His babysitter had canceled at 6 a.m. No warning, no apology, just a text message that made Samuel's stomach drop. "Sorry, can't make it." Peter was 12 years old enough to understand that his father worked as a cleaner in other people's houses, old enough to know they couldn't afford to lose another job, old enough to stay quiet in corners and make himself invisible, but not old enough for what was about to happen. You cannot bring him here. Richard Luther stood in the servants' entrance. Though blocking the doorway like a wall of expensive cologne and barely contained irritation, his eyes moved from Samuel's worn shoes to Samuel's son's backpack, calculating something he couldn't name. "Samuel, we've discussed boundaries." "Mr. Luther." Samuel's voice cracked. He hated that sound, the sound of desperation. "My sitter canceled and I have nowhere. This is a business dinner." He cut him off without raising his voice. "That's what money did. It made you powerful enough not to shout. I have investors flying in from Paris and Tokyo. Do you understand what that means?" Peter watched his father's shoulders curl inward, making him smaller. He'd seen it happen before. Different houses, different men in suits, always the same ending. "He'll stay in the corner," Samuel whispered. His hand found Peter's shoulder, squeezing once. "On their silent code. Be invisible. You won't even know he's there." Richard Luther looked at Peter for exactly 3 seconds. It felt like an hour. Then he stepped aside. "One sound," he said. "One interruption and you're both gone." "Understood?" Samuel nodded so hard his neck hurt. The mansion smelled like furniture polish and fresh flowers arranged by people who charged more per hour than Samuel made in a day. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high Peter had to tilt his head back to see them. Every surface gleamed. Nothing was out of place except him. Richard pointed to a cream-colored sofa near the grand staircase, far from the dining room, but visible from every angle. "There," he said, "don't touch anything." Peter sat. His feet didn't reach the floor. Samuel disappeared into the kitchen, his head down, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd learned to exist in spaces that weren't meant for him. Through the doorway, Peter could hear him pacing. The investors arrived in stages. First came the laughter from the driveway. Then voices in the foyer speaking languages Peter recognized, but Richard didn't expect him to. French and English sliding in and out of each other like water. "The market analysis looks favorable," one man said in English, his accent sharp around the edges. "Bien sûr, but the risk allocation," another replied, switching to French mid-sentence, "needs clarification before we proceed." Peter's ears perked up, not because he was trying to listen, because he couldn't help it. His father called it a gift. His third-grade teacher called it unusual linguistic development. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman Samuel used to work for, called it having an ear for music. Mrs. Chen had been French, married to an American, living in California with a grandson she hadn't seen in 12 years. She'd spent 3 years teaching Peter without meaning to, filling the silence of her big empty house with stories in 3 languages. "You remind me of him," she used to say, touching Peter's cheek with papery hands. "He would have been your age now." Then she was gone, and Samuel lost that job too. Richard Luther moved through the room like a conductor, orchestrating conversations, pouring wine, laughing at precisely the right moments. He wore confidence like another expensive suit. Peter made himself smaller on the sofa, pulled his knees up, opened a library book about ancient Egypt, and pretended to read while the men talked business over appetizers that cost more than his school lunch for a month. "The terms are quite clear," one investor said in French, his tone smooth as silk. "Absolutely," Richard agreed in English. Crystal clear, but they weren't saying the same thing. Peter's head came up from his book. The French investor had just said something about adjustable terms while speaking English about fixed rates. The words didn't match, not even close. He looked at his father, visible for a moment in the dining room doorway. He was watching him with wide eyes. "Don't," his expression said. "Please don't." Peter went back to his book, read the same sentence 4 times without understanding a single word. "How delightful," one of the wives said, noticing him for the first time. Richard, "You didn't mention you had a son." The room went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "That's the chauffeur's kid," Richard said smoothly. "He had a child care emergency." The woman's smile didn't falter, but something behind her eyes did. "Oh," she said. "How accommodating of you." No one looked at Peter after that. He ceased to exist again, just part of the furniture, less important than the chairs they sat on. Dinner was served. The maids moved between the kitchen and dining room, filling water glasses before anyone noticed they were empty, removing plates before anyone finished chewing. Peter watched them so closely as they set down different platters of something that smelled like herbs and money. The conversation grew louder. Wine made people confident. Deals made them careless. "The liability clause," one investor said in French, leaning back in his chair. "It's quite favorable for us." "No, very favorable," another agreed in French. "He won't realize until it's too late." Richard raised his glass. "Gentlemen, I believe we have the foundation for something extraordinary." They toasted in 3 languages, clinked crystal that cost more than Peter's school tuition, smiled with teeth that had been professionally whitened, and Peter felt his heart start to pound because Richard had just agreed to terms that weren't translated. Liability that shifted entirely to him, an exit clause that only existed in French. And the whole deal was structured in 2 different ways depending on which language you understood. His father appeared at his side, his face tight with warning. "Peter," he whispered, "not a word, not one word." "But Dad, there no." He crouched down, his voice desperate. "Son, I know what you're thinking. Don't, please don't. He doesn't know what he's agreeing to. It's not our business." Samuel's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We don't get to have opinions in houses like this. We just work. We keep our heads down. We survive." Peter looked past him at Richard Luther, who was signing something now, laughing, completely unaware that he was about to lose everything. "Dad, if you say anything," Samuel's voice broke, "if you embarrass me in front of these people, I will lose this job. And it took me 3 months to find this one." "But 3 months, Peter, do you understand what that means?" He understood. He understood they were 2 paychecks away from eviction, that his shoes were held together with duct tape, that his father cried quietly in the bathroom when he thought he was asleep, but he also understood what was happening at that table. "Go to the porch," Samuel said. "Please just go wait in the porch until this is over." Peter stood, started walking toward the exit door, got 3 steps away. Then he heard Richard Luther say, "Well, gentlemen, I think we're ready to finalize this. My lawyer will review the documents tomorrow, but I see no issues." "Parfait," the French investor said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "No issues at all." Peter stopped walking. His father's hand grabbed his arm. "Peter, no. They're lying to him," Peter said. Not loud, but not quiet either. The dining room went silent. Richard Luther turned slowly in his chair. His expression was polite confusion, the kind adults wear when children say something unexpected. "I'm sorry, what?" Samuel's face went white. "Mr. Luther, I apologize." He didn't mean. "They're saying different things," Peter continued, his voice steadier now in English and French. "It's not the same deal." For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Richard Luther laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh. Not yet. It was the laugh of someone genuinely amused by something absurd. The other men joined in, polite chuckles, bemused smiles. "Well," Richard said, still smiling, "that's quite an imagination you have there, son." "I'm not your son," Peter said quietly, "and I'm not imagining it." The temperature in the room dropped 12 degrees. Richard's smile stayed in place, but his eyes went hard. "Samuel, please remove your child from the dining area." "Yes, sir." "Right away, I'm so sorry." Samuel grabbed Peter's arm harder. "Wait." One of the investors leaned forward, curiosity replacing amusement. "How do you know what we're saying?" Peter looked at his father. He was shaking his head frantically, mouthing the word "no" over and over. "I speak 3 languages," Peter said. "Portuguese, English, and French." The room exploded with laughter. Real laughter this time. Richard Luther nearly choked on his wine. "3 languages," he repeated, wiping his eyes. "Oh, that's rich. That's absolutely rich." "Richard," one of the wives tried. Maybe he, a 12-year-old from Richard, gestured vaguely at Samuel, at Peter, at everything they represented, tells me he speaks 3 languages. What's next? Is he going to critique my wine selection? The investors were laughing now, not cruelly, just the way people laugh at something they don't take seriously, like a dog doing calculus, like a fish riding a bicycle. Samuel's face crumpled. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Luther." He watches videos online and he thinks, "I don't think," Peter said. His voice cracked. "I know, and they're cheating you." The laughter stopped. Richard Luther stood up slowly, like a storm gathering itself. "Get him out," he said quietly. "Now, they said in French that the liability is all yours," Peter said quickly, the words tumbling out. "That the exit clause lets them walk away without penalty, but you can't. In English, they told you it's equal. It's not equal. It's a trap, Samuel." Richard's voice could have frozen water. "Remove your child." The clause de sortie is quite favorable for us," Peter said in perfect French. "He won't understand until he signs." The room went dead silent. One of the French investors' faces changed just for a second. But Peter saw it. Richard saw it too. "What did you just say?" Richard asked slowly. "That's what they said 15 minutes ago." Peter pulled away from his father's grip. "While you were pouring wine, they said in French that the exit clause is quite favorable for them, and you won't understand until you sign. But in English, they told you the terms are crystal clear and completely fair." That's Richard looked at his investors. "That's not the risk allocation section," Peter continued. His voice was shaking now, but he couldn't stop. "In English, they said it's distributed equally. In French, they said he assumes all the risks. Not them. You, not them. You." One of the investors started to speak, stopped, started again in heavily accented English. "This is a misunderstanding. This isn't a misunderstanding," Peter said, his voice steady now. "I heard every word. I heard every word. You've been running 2 different deals this whole time. One in English for Mr. Luther, one in French for each other, and they don't match." Richard Luther sat down slowly. His face had gone completely blank, the expensive kind of blank that came before extremely expensive decisions. "Is this true?" he asked his investors. "Richard, let's discuss this rationally. Is it true?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Peter had ever heard. Samuel sank into a chair, covering his face with his hands. He was crying now, quiet, helpless tears. Richard picked up the contract, started reading, his jaw tightened with every line. "Get out," he said finally. Quiet, deadly. "Richard, if you'll just get out of my house." The investors stood, gathered their papers, walked out without another word. Their wives followed, clutching designer purses, not looking at anyone. The front door closed. Then it was just 3 people in that massive dining room. Samuel, Peter, and Richard Luther, holding a contract that would have bankrupted him. Samuel lifted his head. "Mr. Luther, I'll pack my things." "Sit down," Richard said. He froze. "Please," he added, and it was the please that made him sink back into the chair. Richard looked at Peter. "Really?" Looked at him for the first time. "How old are you?" 12. "And you speak 3 languages?" "Yes, sir." "Where did you learn?" Peter glanced at his father. He nodded barely. "Mrs. Chen," he said. "She used to be Dad's client. She was French and she was lonely and she taught me while Dad worked." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he set down the contract, rubbed his face with both hands, laughed once, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I almost lost everything," he said to no one in particular. "I almost signed away everything I've built because I was too arrogant to listen to a 12-year-old. "You didn't know," Peter said quietly. "I didn't listen." Richard looked at him. "There's a difference." Samuel was still crying, but silently now. The kind of crying that comes from too many years of too much fear. Richard stood, walked to the window, looked out at his perfect lawn, his perfect cars. See, his perfect life that had almost fallen apart because he'd assumed perfection meant being right. "I need to call my lawyer," he said finally. "This whole deal needs to be reviewed. Every word, every clause." He turned back to them. "Samuel, you're not fired. You're getting a raise and your hours are changing. No more nights, no more weekends. And Peter?" He stopped. Started again. "Peter can come here after school if he needs to. He can do homework in the library. He can eat dinner with us." A pause. "If you want," Peter didn't know what to say. Neither did his father. "I heard you," Richard said quietly. "Finally, I heard you. And I'm sorry it took almost losing everything for me to listen." He walked to the door, stopped. "The glass I broke earlier," he said. "It was my grandfather's whiskey glass. He gave it to me when I made my first $1 million, told me to remember where I came from." He smiled, sad and small. "I guess I forgot." Then he left them there, Samuel and Peter, father and son, still sitting in chairs, as they weren't supposed to touch in a house that wasn't theirs, trying to understand what had just happened. Samuel pulled Peter into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. He was still crying, but now he was laughing too. The kind of laugh that comes from relief so profound it feels like joy. "You scared me to death," he whispered into his hair. "Don't ever do that again." "Okay. But also," he pulled back to look at him. "Also, I'm so proud of you. I could burst." Peter smiled, then frowned. "Dad, do you think he meant it about me coming here after school?" Samuel wiped his eyes. I looked around the dining room at the crystal and the china ware, and the life he'd spent years cleaning but never touching. "I don't know, son," he said honestly. "But I think we just found out that speaking up matters, even when you're scared. Maybe especially when you're scared." Upstairs, Richard Luther sat in his office with his head in his hands. The contract sat on his desk, every page a reminder of his own blindness. His phone buzzed, his lawyer calling back, but he didn't answer. Instead, he thought about a 12-year-old boy who saw what he couldn't see, who spoke up when it cost him everything to do it, who was worth listening to despite wearing duct tape shoes and carrying a second-hand backpack. He thought about Samuel, who raised that boy while cleaning other people's toilets, and who taught him to be brave even while teaching him to be invisible. And he thought about the glass he'd broken that afternoon, not accidentally. He'd thrown it against the wall in frustration over another business deal that felt wrong. The glass had shattered, just like his assumptions. Maybe it was time to break a few more things, like the rules that said some people mattered and others didn't. Like the belief that money meant being right, like the walls between people who served and people who were served. Maybe it was time to listen. The phone buzzed again. This time, Richard answered. "James," he said to his lawyer, "clear your schedule. We need to review every contract I've signed in the past 5 years." And then he paused. "Then I need you to draw up some paperwork for a scholarship fund for talented kids who need a chance." "What brought this on?" his lawyer asked. Richard looked at the broken glass still scattered on his office floor, at the contract that would have ruined him, at the view from his window that suddenly looked different. "Let's just say," he said quietly, "someone reminded me what I'd forgotten." He hung up, went back downstairs, found Samuel and Peter still in the dining room looking lost. "Have you two eaten?" Richard asked. They shook their heads. "Then let's fix that," he said. "And Peter, while we eat, why don't you tell me about Mrs. Chen? She sounds like someone worth knowing." For the first time in 12 years, and Peter Ross sat at a dining room table that wasn't in his own home and didn't feel like he was trespassing. His father sat beside him, his back straight for the first time all day, and Richard Luther sat across from them, learning what it meant to listen to voices he'd spent a lifetime ignoring. The crystals still gleamed. The chandeliers still sparkled. The mansion was still perfect. But something fundamental had shifted, something that started with breaking glass and ended with breaking down the walls that separated people into categories of worth. It started with a boy who refused to be invisible, and it would change everything. Peter woke up at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of his father crying in the bathroom. Not the loud kind of crying, the kind he tried to hide behind running water and closed doors. And the kind that made his chest hurt because he knew exactly what it meant. He thought they'd lost everything. He pressed his ear against the thin door. "Dad." The water shut off. Silence. Then his voice, too bright, too forced. "I'm fine, son. Go back to sleep. It's almost 6 o'clock. Peter leaned his forehead against the door. "And you're not fine." The lock clicked. Samuel opened the door, his eyes red but dry now. He'd wiped away the evidence, but Peter had learned to read the things he couldn't hide. The trembling hands, the way he held himself too still, like moving might crack him open. "I had a bad dream," he lied. About last night, it wasn't a question. Samuel sank onto the edge of the bathtub, suddenly looking decades older than 52 years. "Peter, I need you to understand something. What you did yesterday." I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I know I should have stayed quiet. I know I embarrassed you." "Stop." Samuel grabbed his shoulders, looking him straight in the eyes. "Don't you dare apologize for being right. Don't you ever apologize for speaking the truth." Peter blinked. "But you said I was scared. I'm still scared." His voice cracked. "Because men like Richard Luther, they say things in the moment. Beautiful things. But when the sun comes up and they remember who we are," he trailed off, unable to finish. "You think he'll fire you today?" Samuel stood, turned away, started folding towels that didn't need folding. "I think we need to be prepared for anything, which means you go to school like normal. You don't tell anyone what happened. And if when I come home early today we start looking for my next job," he said. He said a lot of things, Peter. After almost losing millions of dollars, after being humiliated by a 12-year-old in front of investors, he finally looked at him. People say what they need to say in moments like that. It doesn't mean they mean it when reality sets in. Peter wanted to argue, wanted to believe that last night had changed something fundamental, but he'd learned early that hope was expensive and they couldn't afford to buy too much of it. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll go to school." Samuel kissed his forehead, holding on a second too long. "I love you no matter what happens today." "Love you too, Dad." He left for the Luther mansion at 6:30 a.m., his uniform pressed, his face carefully blank. Peter watched from their apartment window as he walked to the bus stop. His shoulders curved inward against the morning cold, or maybe against what was coming. The Luther mansion looked different in daylight, less like a palace, more like what it actually was, a statement. Every perfectly trimmed hedge screamed, "I have money." Every gleaming window reflected back the world that didn't belong to people like Samuel Ross. He used his key to enter through the service entrance. The kitchen was empty. Usually, Mrs. Chen. No, that was the other house years ago. Usually, nobody was here this early except Samuel. But today, Richard Luther sat at the kitchen counter drinking coffee from a mug that probably cost more than his weekly paycheck. Samuel froze. "Mr. Luther?" "I didn't expect I can come back." "Sit down, Samuel." His heart stopped. This was it. The speech before the firing. You're a good worker, but conversation that always ended the same way. "Sir, if this is about last night, sit down." Not angry, just firm. Samuel sat, his hands folded tight in his lap, bracing for impact. Richard sat down his coffee. He looked tired, like he'd been up all night. "I called my lawyer at midnight," he said. "Woke him up, made him review every document those investors sent me." Samuel said nothing. What could he say? Peter was right about everything. Every single word. Richard laughed, but it sounded broken. The liability clause, the exit terms, the risk allocation. It was all structured to bankrupt me if anything went wrong. And they buried it in French, knowing I'd never catch it because I was too arrogant to hire a proper translator. "I'm sorry," Samuel whispered. "Why are you apologizing?" Your son saved me from the biggest mistake of my career." He stood, paced to the window. "Do you know what I did after you left last night?" Samuel shook his head. "I sat in my office and looked at every business deal I've made in the last 5 years, every contract, every negotiation, and you know what I realized?" He turned to face Samuel. "I've been making decisions based on confidence instead of competence, on image instead of information. I've been so sure I was the smartest person in every room that I stopped actually listening to anyone. Mr. Luther, a 12-year-old, had to save me from myself." He laughed again. That same broken sound. A 12-year-old who sits in corners trying to be invisible while I parade around thinking I'm invincible. The silence stretched. Samuel didn't dare break it. "I meant what I said last night," Richard said finally. "About the raise, about the hours, about Peter being welcome here," he paused. "But I need to know if you trust that. Because if you don't, if you think I'm just saying words because I feel guilty, then we need to have a different conversation." Samuel looked up at him. Really looked. He'd cleaned this man's house for 10 months, but this was the first time he'd ever actually seen him as a person, instead of just an employer. A person who made mistakes, who felt embarrassed, who was trying in his own clumsy way to do something right. "I'm scared," he admitted. "We've been here before. Different houses, different promises, they always end the same way." "I know." Richard sat back down. "And I can't prove I'm different with words. I can only prove it with time, with action, with he stopped, started again. My grandfather cleaned floors at a factory for 30 years. He saved every penny so my father could go to college. My father built a small business so I could have opportunities he never had. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that my success was built on the backs of people who cleaned floors." Samuel felt tears threatening. She pushed them down. "Why are you telling me this?" Because you deserve to know that I understand, that I see the risk you're taking by trusting me, that I won't waste it. He slid a folder across the counter. New contract, guaranteed hours, health benefits, a salary that reflects what you're actually worth, not what the market says I can get away with paying you. Samuel's hands shook as she opened the folder. The numbers on the page didn't make sense. They were too high, almost double what he was making now. I can't. This is too much. It's not enough, Richard interrupted. But it's a start. And if you stay, if you give me a chance to prove this is real, then we'll revisit it in a few months, along with something else. He pulled out another paper, a college fund for Peter, full ride to any school that accepts him when the time comes. Samuel couldn't stop the tears now. They came hot and fast, years of fear and exhaustion pouring out. Why? Because your son saw the truth when everyone else, including me, refused to look. Because he spoke up when it cost him everything to do it. Because talent and intelligence don't care about zip codes or bank accounts. Richard's voice softened. And because maybe, if I do this right, I can remember who I'm supposed to be. Samuel wiped his eyes. I'd looked at the contract. At the man who'd spent months being just an employer and was now trying to become something more complicated. Something like decent. What about Peter? He asked. You really meant it about him coming here after school? I'd like him to if he wants to. Richard hesitated. I need to apologize to him properly for laughing, for dismissing him, for making him feel like he didn't matter. He's 12. He'll forgive you. That doesn't mean I don't owe him the apology. Samuel closed the folder, held it against his chest like a shield. Or maybe a promise. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, we'll try. But if anything changes, if this turns out to be just guilt or charity, I need you to tell me. Don't let us build hope on something that isn't real. I promise. Richard extended his hand. Samuel shook it, and his grip was firm, but not crushing, equal, like they were two people making an agreement, not an employer bestowing mercy. Thank you, he whispered. Thank your son, Richard replied. He's the one who started all this. 3 blocks away, Peter Ross sat in his 7th grade classroom, staring at a math worksheet he couldn't focus on. He kept thinking about his father, about the look on his face this morning, about the way he'd said, when I come home early, instead of, if his teacher, Ms. Rivera, stopped beside his desk. Peter, everything okay? He nodded automatically. Yes, ma'am. Or you haven't written anything in 20 minutes because his father was probably getting fired right now, because they'd probably have to move again, because he'd tried to do the right thing and it was going to cost them everything. But he couldn't say that. So he picked up his pencil and wrote 78 instead of 56. Ms. Rivera squeezed his shoulder once gently, then moved on. She knew. Teachers always knew, but knowing didn't fix anything. The morning dragged. Lunch came and went. Peter ate alone like always, trying not to think about his father sitting on their worn couch, circling job ads in the newspaper. At 2:15 p.m., the classroom phone rang. Ms. Rivera answered, listened, then looked at Peter with an expression he couldn't read. Peter, you need to gather your things. Someone's here to pick you up. His stomach dropped. But early pickup meant emergency. Emergency meant everything had fallen apart. He packed his backpack with shaking hands, walked to the office like he was walking to his own funeral. But it wasn't his father waiting in the office. It was Richard Luther, wearing jeans and a regular shirt, looking completely out of place among the plastic chairs and children's artwork. He stood when Peter entered, his hands in his pockets like he didn't know what to do with them. Hi, Peter, he said, and then, before anyone else could speak, I owe you an apology. Peter stared. The office secretary stared. Ms. Rivera, who'd followed him down, stared. I laughed at you, Richard continued. I dismissed you. I made you feel small and unimportant, and I was wrong. Completely. Thoroughly wrong. You were the only person in that room brave enough to speak the truth. And I'm sorry I didn't listen the first time you tried to tell me. Peter felt his throat close up. It's okay. It's not okay. But I'm going to do better. Richard crouched down to Peter's eye level. Your dad said yes to all of it. The new contract, the hours, the college fund. And I'm here to ask if you'd be willing to give me a second chance. Come to the house after school, do homework, have dinner with us. Let me prove that last night meant something. Peter looked at Ms. Rivera. She nodded slightly, her eyes suspiciously bright. Where's my dad? Peter asked. At the house, waiting for you. Richard smiled, small and uncertain. He wanted to be here, but we figured you might prefer a familiar face for the drive home. You're driving me if that's okay with you. Peter thought about the bus ride, about going home to their empty apartment, about his father's tears this morning. Then he thought about last night, about speaking up even when he was terrified, about the way Richard had looked at him after the investors left. Really looked at him maybe for the first time. Okay, Peter said. Let's go. Richard stood, relief clear on his face. Thank you for giving me a chance. As they walked out to the parking lot to a car that cost more than 20 years of his father's old salary, Peter realized something. Last night had broken glass, but today was about building something new from the pieces, something that might actually last. The car ride was silent for the first 3 minutes. Peter sat in the back seat of Richard's Mercedes. Now watching the city blur past the window. The leather smelled new. Everything in this car probably cost more than his dad made in a year. You can sit up front if you want, Richard said, glancing in the rearview mirror. I'm okay back here. Another minute of silence. Then Richard cleared his throat. Your teacher seems nice, Miss Rivera. She is. She looked surprised when I showed up. Everyone was surprised. Peter finally looked at Richard's reflection in the mirror. Rich people don't usually pick up kids from my school. Richard winced. I suppose they don't. It's okay. I'm used to being the different one. That shouldn't be something you're used to. Richard pulled up to a red light, turned slightly in his seat. Peter, I need you to understand something. What I'm trying to do here with the contract, I'm the college fund bringing you to the house. It's not charity. What is it then? It's me trying to be less of an idiot. The light turned green. Richard drove. My whole life I've surrounded myself with people who tell me I'm smart, who agree with everything I say, who laugh at my jokes even when they're not funny. And somewhere along the way, I started believing I actually was the smartest person in every room. Peter said nothing, just listened. Then a 12-year-old proved me wrong in front of everyone. Richard's voice caught. And instead of being grateful, my first instinct was to laugh, to dismiss you, to protect my ego instead of protecting my business. You didn't know I really spoke French. I didn't care enough to find out. Richard pulled into his driveway, killed the engine, turned to face Peter fully. Now that's the part that keeps me up at night. Not that I didn't believe you, that I didn't even consider you might be telling the truth. Peter unbuckled his seatbelt slowly. My dad says rich people don't see us. They see through us like we're glass. Your dad is right. Richard opened his door and I'm trying to break that glass if you'll let me. They walked into the house together. Samuel was in the kitchen and the relief on his face when he saw Peter made his chest tight. Peter. He pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than usual. You okay? Mr. Luther apologized in front of everyone at school. Samuel looked at Richard over Peter's head. Something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or the beginning of trust. He told me. Samuel said, Come on, I made your favorite. Peter stopped. You cooked here? Mister. Luther said I could use the kitchen. Said, This is our home now, too, if we wanted it to be. The words hung in the air. Home. They'd lived in 8 different apartments in Peter's 12 years. None of them had ever felt like home. They were just places they stayed until the rent went up, or the landlord decided he didn't like the look of them. Not the whole house, Richard added quickly. I'm not saying move in. I mean, he stopped, started over. What I mean is you're welcome here, both of you. Not as employee and employer as he struggled for the word. People, Peter offered. Yes, as people. Dinner was awkward at first. They sat at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room where the disaster had happened last night. Samuel had made a Ross concoction, and its scent crept through the house, carrying something that felt almost like warmth. This is incredible, Richard said after the first bite. I've been eating restaurant food for so long I forgot what real cooking tastes like. Samuel smiled, small but genuine. My grandmother's recipe. Tell me about her. And Samuel did slowly at first, then with more confidence. He talked about growing up in a tiny house in São Paulo, about his grandmother who raised 6 kids while working 3 jobs, about coming to America with nothing but hope and a suitcase. Peter watched his father transform, saw his shoulders straighten, heard his voice grow stronger. This was the dad he saw at home, not the invisible man he became in other people's houses. Richard listened like he was hearing the most important story ever told. Asked questions. He laughed at the funny parts, looked genuinely sad at the hard parts. Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman, he said. She would have liked you, Samuel replied, then caught himself. I mean, she would have seen right through me. Richard finished. Would have called me out on my nonsense. Probably, Samuel smiled. She didn't believe in wasting words on politeness when truth was more important. Peter comes by it honestly. Then they ate in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Richard set down his fork. I have a proposition, and I want you both to think about it honestly before answering. Peter felt his stomach tighten. Here it comes, the catch. There was always a catch. I need help, Richard said simply. Real help. I'm restructuring my entire business, every contract, every deal, every partnership. And I realized something. I can't do it alone. I don't trust my judgment anymore. What kind of help? Samuel asked carefully. Peter? Richard looked at him directly. I need someone who sees what others miss, who isn't afraid to speak up, who understands that words matter, especially when they're in different languages. I'm 12, Peter said. I know, which is why I'm not offering you a job. I'm offering you an education. Richard pulled out a folder. There's a program at the University for Gifted Kids. Language immersion, cultural studies, translation theory. It's designed for high schoolers, but I called in a favor. They'll test you. If you qualify, you'd attend twice a week. After school, Peter's heart raced. That sounds expensive. That's not your concern. Your concern is whether you want to do it. Why? Peter asked. Why do all this? Richard was quiet for a long moment. Because I have a daughter, he said finally. Had she died 5 years ago? Car accident. She was 18. The kitchen went silent. Her name was Lana. Richard's voice cracked. She wanted to be a translator for the UN, spoke 6 different languages, could have spoken 10 if she'd had the time. He wiped his eyes roughly. After she died, I threw myself into work. Stopped seeing people as people. Just saw deals and numbers and ways to make more money. Samuel reached across the table, squeezed his hand once. Then you showed up, Richard continued, looking at Peter. Speaking 3 languages, seeing things I couldn't see. And for a moment I saw Lana, not as a replacement. You're not her, but as a reminder of what matters. Of who matters. Peter felt tears on his cheeks, but didn't wipe them away. I'll try, he said. If the test says I'm good enough, I'll try. You're already good enough, Richard said firmly. The test just proves it to everyone else. They finished dinner with lighter conversation. Richard asked about Pete's favorite subjects, history and reading, his least favorite, gym, what he wanted to be when he grew up. He didn't know yet, and that was okay. After they ate, Richard showed Peter the library, floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books, a reading corner with a window seat, a desk with good lighting. "This is yours now. If you want it, do homework here. Read whatever interests you. I'll stay out of your way." Peter ran his hand along the spines. More books than he'd ever seen outside a library. "Can I really? It's just collecting dust otherwise. Lana used to spend hours in here." Richard smiled. Sad but real. "I think she'd like knowing someone was using it again." That night, as Richard drove them back to their apartment, Peter asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "What happened to the investors? The ones from last night?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I filed a complaint with the International Business Bureau. They're being investigated for fraud. Won't be able to operate in the U.S. for a long time." "Good," Peter said quietly. "Your bravery did that. Your willingness to speak up even when everyone told you not to." Richard pulled up to their building. "Don't ever lose that, okay? Don't let the world teach you to be smaller than you are." And Samuel and Peter walked up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment. The building smelled like old cooking and mildew. Their door stuck the way it always did. Inside, their furniture was worn and mismatched, but something had changed. "Dad," Peter asked as he tucked him into bed, "do you think this is real?" Samuel sat on the edge of his mattress. "I think Richard is trying. I think he's hurting and lost and trying to do something good with his grief." He brushed hair from Peter's forehead. "But we'll be careful, okay? We'll protect our hearts while we see if his intentions match his actions." "I like him," Peter admitted, "even though I'm scared, too." "Me too, son. Me too." After Samuel left, Peter lay in the dark thinking about Lana, who never got to be a UN translator. About his dad, who spent years being invisible. About Richard, who had everything except the thing that mattered most. About how one dinner party had cracked open 3 lives and let the light in. He thought about the library, about the books waiting for him, about the program at the university, about possibilities that hadn't existed 48 hours ago. And he thought about what Richard had said. "Don't let the world teach you to be smaller than you are." Peter Ross had spent 12 years making himself invisible, shrinking to fit into corners of other people's houses, learning to take up less space. Maybe it was time to learn something different. Maybe it was time to stop disappearing. 6 miles away, Richard Luther sat in Lana's room for the first time in months. Her medals from language competitions still hung on the wall. Her books lined the shelves in alphabetical order because she'd been meticulous like that. "I met a kid today," he said to the empty room. "He reminds me of you. Smart, brave, sees the world in more colors than most people." The room didn't answer. It never did. "I'm going to help him. The way I should have helped more people when you were alive, the way you always wanted me to." Richard's voice broke. "I can't bring you back, but maybe I can make sure another kid with your gift doesn't get overlooked. Maybe that's something." He sat there until midnight talking to his daughter who would never answer, making promises to a boy he barely knew, trying to figure out how to be a person worth listening to. Outside, the city slept. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The test at the university, more conversations, more chances to get it right or wrong. But tonight, 3 people lay in their separate beds, each carrying a small flame of hope. They were afraid to examine too closely because hope was dangerous when you'd spent your whole life learning to live without it. But maybe, just maybe, this time, it was worth the risk. The university testing center smelled like old paper and nervous energy. Peter sat in a chair too big for him, surrounded by teenagers who looked twice his age. They stared at him, some curious, most dismissive. A 12-year-old didn't belong here. He almost got up and left. Peter Ross, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, appeared in the doorway. "I'm Dr. Chen." "Yes, like your Mrs. Chen. Different family, but I knew her. She talked about you." Peter's throat went tight. "She did?" She called you her accidental grandson, said you had a gift. Dr. Chen smiled. Let's see if she was right. The test room was small, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a recording device. Dr. Chen sat across from him, her hands folded calmly. I'm going to speak to you in 3 languages: Portuguese, English, and French. Sometimes I'll switch mid-sentence. I want you to respond in whatever language feels natural. Don't think about it. Just let it flow. Understand? Peter nodded. Good. Let's begin. Dr. Chen switched to Portuguese without warning. Tell me why you're here today. Peter answered in Portuguese, explaining about the dinner party, about the investors, about Richard wanting to help him learn. Dr. Chen switched to French mid-conversation, and you caught the discrepancy purely by listening. Peter followed into French automatically. I didn't mean to. The words just didn't match. Back to English. Most adults miss those nuances. How did a 12-year-old catch them? Because nobody expects me to understand, Peter replied, so they don't hide what they're saying. They just say it. Dr. Chen's expression shifted. Invisibility is an advantage, something like that. For the next hour, Dr. Chen threw everything at him. Rapid switches between languages, technical terms, idiomatic expressions that didn't translate directly, cultural context that required understanding beyond vocabulary. Peter kept up. Sometimes he stumbled, but he recovered. Let the sounds guide him instead of overthinking the grammar. When it ended, Dr. Chen sat back and studied him. Mrs. Chen was right about you, but she undersold it. She made notes on her tablet. You don't just speak 3 languages, you think in them. That's extraordinarily rare, especially for someone your age. Is that good? It's remarkable. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Peter, I'm recommending you for immediate acceptance into the program, but I need to be honest with you about what that means. Peter's stomach flipped. Okay, this won't be easy. You'll be the youngest student by 4 years. The work will be challenging. Some of the other students will resent you for being here. Some will doubt you belong. She paused. Can you handle that? Peter thought about sitting in corners of mansions, about being laughed at by adults in expensive suits, about his father's tears in the bathroom. I've been handling it my whole life, he said quietly. Then welcome to the program. Doctor. And Chen extended her hand. Classes start next Tuesday. Don't be late. Richard was pacing in the hallway when Peter emerged. Well, I got in. Richard's face split into a grin so wide it looked painful. Of course you did. Of course you... He stopped himself, took a breath. How do you feel? Scared, Peter admitted. Good. If you weren't scared, you wouldn't be paying attention. Richard crouched down. Listen to me. Some of those kids are going to make this hard for you. They're going to question whether you deserve to be there. Are you ready for that? Are you asking if I'm going to quit? I'm asking if you know you're worthy enough to stay. Peter met his eyes. Mrs. Chen used to say that courage isn't not being afraid. It's being afraid and doing it anyway. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Peter shouldered his backpack. Can we go tell my dad? They found Samuel at the mansion reorganizing the kitchen pantry. When he saw their faces, he dropped everything he was holding. He got in, Richard said simply. Samuel covered his mouth with both hands. Tears spilled over immediately. I start Tuesday. Peter ran to him and he pulled him into a hug so fierce he could barely breathe. I'm so proud of you, he whispered into his ear. So proud. I'm scared, Dad. Being scared means it matters, means you care. He pulled back to look at him. And you're going to be amazing. That evening, Richard ordered pizza instead of cooking. They ate in the library, surrounded by Lana's books, and Peter finally asked the question that had been burning since yesterday. What was she like? Lana? Richard went still. Samuel tensed, ready to redirect if needed. But Richard took a breath and answered. stubborn, brilliant. She argued with me about everything. His voice was rough but steady. She wanted to change the world through words, believed that most conflicts came from misunderstanding, and if people could just truly hear each other, the world would be better. Peter finished. Exactly. Richard smiled, sad, but genuine. She would have loved meeting you, would have grilled you on grammar rules and challenged you to translation competitions. Who would have won? Her. Always her. Richard laughed, and this time it sounded almost real, but she would have respected that you pushed her to work for it. They sat in comfortable silence, eating pizza and passing around a 2-liter of soda like they were just a normal family having a normal evening. Except they weren't normal. They were 3 broken people trying to figure out how to fit their jagged edges together without cutting each other. "Can I ask you something?" Peter said suddenly. "Why did you really come to my school yesterday?" Richard sat down his pizza. "Because I needed you to know I meant it. Words are easy. Showing up is harder." He met Peter's eyes. "And because I was terrified you'd say no, that you'd decide I wasn't worth the risk. I almost did." "What changed your mind?" Peter thought about it. "You apologized in front of everyone. Rich people don't do that. They make excuses or blame other people or just pretend it didn't happen." He paused. "You didn't pretend. I couldn't, and not after what you did for me. I just told the truth." "No," Richard said firmly. "You risked everything to tell the truth. There's a difference." Later, as Richard drove them home, Peter watched the city lights blur past his city, the same streets he'd walked his whole life. But somehow, they looked different now. "Richard," he said quietly, "what happens if I fail at the program? Then you'll have tried something difficult and learned from it. But what if I embarrass you?" Richard pulled over, turned to face Peter fully. "Listen to me very carefully. You could walk into that program, say nothing but curse words in all 3 languages, and set the building on fire, and I would still be proud of you for trying." Peter laughed, despite himself. "That's a low bar. My point is, you don't owe me success. You don't owe me perfection. You owe yourself the chance to see what you're capable of." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "I lost that chance with Lana. I was always pushing her to be better, to achieve more. And then she was gone. And I never got to tell her that she was already enough. I think she knew. Maybe. But I should have said it more." Richard pulled back onto the road. "So I'm saying it to you now. You're already enough, Peter. Everything else is just extra." When they reached the apartment, Samuel walked Peter upstairs while Richard waited in the car. At their door, he knelt down to his level. "This program, the mansion, Richard, it's all moving so fast. Are you okay with that?" Peter considered. "I think so. It's weird, but good weird. If it ever stops feeling good, you tell me immediately. We walk away. No matter what." He gripped his shoulders. "You understand? Nothing is worth losing yourself over." "I understand, Dad." "Good." He kissed his forehead. "Now get inside and do your homework. Some things stay normal even when everything else is changing." Peter went inside, but before starting homework, he pulled out the library book about ancient Egypt he'd been reading the night of the dinner party. He'd barely gotten through 3 pages that night, too distracted by the conversations happening around him. Now he could barely remember why he'd been so interested in pyramids. The world had gotten bigger and scary and full of possibility. He thought about Tuesday, about walking into a room full of teenagers who would see him as a child, about proving himself over and over, about carrying the weight of Richard's grief and his father's hopes and Mrs. Chen's memory. It was a lot for 12-year-old shoulders. But then he remembered Richard's words, "You don't owe me perfection." And his father's "nothing is worth losing yourself over." And Dr. Chen's advice from the program, invisibility as an advantage. Maybe he didn't need to be perfect. Maybe he just needed to be present, to show up, to speak up when it mattered and stay silent when it didn't. To be Peter Ross, who spoke 3 languages and saw what others missed and refused to stay invisible anymore. He opened his homework folder and started on his math problems. Simple algebra. Easy compared to everything else in his life right now. Sometimes simple was exactly what you needed. Outside, Richard sat in his car, staring at the rundown building where Samuel and Peter lived. 3 flights of stairs, peeling paint, broken intercom. They deserved better. But rushing them into his house would be wrong, would turn this into something it wasn't supposed to be. This wasn't about rescue. It was about respect, about partnership, about 3 people learning to trust each other slowly, carefully, one dinner at a time. He pulled out his phone and texted his lawyer. Start the college fund paperwork. Full ride, any school, no strings. Then he drove home to his empty mansion and sat in Lana's room and told her about Peter's test, about the pizza dinner, about how maybe, just maybe, he was starting to figure out how to be the person she always believed he could be. The room didn't answer, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel quite so empty. Tuesday came faster than Peter expected. He stood outside the university building, backpack heavy on his shoulders, watching college students rush past. None of them looked at him. Why would they? He was just a kid. You ready? Richard asked beside him. No. Good answer. Richard squeezed his shoulder once. Go show them what Mrs. Chen already knew. Peter walked in alone. Richard had offered to come, but this was something he needed to do himself. The classroom held 12 students, all teenagers, all staring when he entered. You're in the wrong room, kid, a tall boy with perfect hair said. Elementary school is across campus. Dr. Chen appeared before Peter could respond. He's exactly where he belongs. Carter, Peter, take the seat up front. The first class was brutal. A technical grammar, complex verb conjugations, cultural context Peter had never encountered. He struggled, made mistakes, felt his face burn when Carter laughed at his pronunciation of a French liaison. But he didn't quit. At lunch, he sat alone in the hallway eating the sandwich his dad packed. 2 girls from class walked past whispering. He caught the words, charity case, and doesn't belong. Peter finished his sandwich and went back inside. The second class was better. Dr. Chen asked them to translate a business contract from English to French. Most students focused on word-for-word accuracy. Peter raised his hand. The literal translation is correct, but the meaning changes. In French, this clause sounds optional. In English, it's mandatory. The room went quiet. Explain, Dr. Chen said. Peter did. He's showing how subtle word choices shifted legal responsibility, how translation wasn't just about vocabulary. It was about understanding what people actually meant. When he finished, Dr. Chen smiled. That's exactly right. That's why we study this. Words have power, especially when they cross languages. Carter didn't laugh anymore. 3 weeks in, Peter came home to find his father crying at their kitchen table. But this time he was smiling too. Pete, look. He showed him a letter, official university letterhead. They want to offer me a position in their facilities department, better pay, benefits, real benefits, Peter, health insurance, retirement. What about Richard? He recommended me. Told them I was the hardest worker he'd ever met. Samuel wiped his eyes. He's letting me go, Peter, not firing, releasing, so I can build something that's mine. Peter hugged him tight. You deserve it, Dad. We both do. That evening, Richard took them to dinner, not at the mansion, at a small restaurant downtown where the tables wobbled and the food was perfect. I'm proud of you, Richard told Samuel. Both of you? You're not sad we're leaving? Peter asked. Sad? No, grateful. Richard set down his fork. You taught me something important, that helping people doesn't mean keeping them. It means giving them what they need to fly. That's really cheesy, Peter said. Richard laughed. Lana used to tell me the same thing. I'm embracing it. What about you? Samuel asked. What happens now? I'm restructuring the company, hiring people who will challenge me, and I'm starting a foundation in Lana's name for kids like Peter, gifted students who need opportunities but can't afford them. The Lana Luther Foundation, Samuel said softly. She would have liked that, Richard's voice caught. She would have liked both of you. On Peter's last day at the mansion library, he found a gift on the desk, a leather journal with his name embossed on the cover. Inside, Richard had written, "For Peter, may you always speak up, even when your voice shakes. May you see what others miss. May you never forget that being small doesn't mean being powerless. You changed my life by refusing to stay invisible. Thank you, Richard." Underneath, in different handwriting, Samuel had added, "Son, you taught me that courage isn't about never being scared. It's about being scared and speaking anyway. I love you more than words in any language can say." Dad! Peter traced the letters with his finger, closed the book, held it against his chest. 4 months after the dinner party, Peter stood in front of his class at the university. Final presentation. He had to translate a speech from English to French and Portuguese, explaining cultural nuances in each. His hands shook. Carter sat in the back row, arms crossed. The other students watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to doubt. Peter took a breath, began speaking. He moved between languages like water, smooth and natural. Explained how the same message shifted meaning across cultures. How translation was about understanding hearts, not just words. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Dr. Chen started clapping. Slowly, the other students joined. Even Carter nodded grudgingly impressed. That doctor. Ed Chen said, is what we're here to learn. Peter just taught you more in 10 minutes than I could in 10 weeks. After class, Carter approached him. You're actually pretty good at this. Thanks, Peter said carefully. Sorry I was a jerk at the start. Carter shrugged. You're 12. It didn't seem fair that you were better than me. I'm not better. I'm just different. Yeah, maybe. Carter extended his hand. See you next semester. Peter shook it. See you next semester. That night, Samuel tucked Peter into bed in their new apartment. 2 bedrooms, working heat, a kitchen where everything actually worked. Dad, Peter asked, do you think Mrs. Chen would be proud? Son, she's watching from wherever wise old ladies go when they die, and she's bragging to everyone about you. Samuel kissed his forehead. I know I am. I was so scared that night at the dinner party. I know, but I spoke up anyway. And you changed everything. Samuel smiled. Not just for us, for Richard too. For every kid who will get a scholarship from Lana's foundation. You started ripples, Peter. They're still spreading. After she left, Peter pulled out the leather journal, opened to the first blank page, wrote, My name is Peter Ross. I'm 12 years old. I speak 3 languages. I used to make myself invisible. Then one night, I decided to be seen. This is what happened. He'd fill the rest of the pages with his story, all of it. The fear and the courage, the failures and the victories, the moments when he wanted to quit but chose to stay, because maybe someone else needed to know that being small didn't mean being powerless. And that speaking up mattered even when your voice shook. That one dinner party could crack open the world and let the light in. Miles away, Richard Luther sat in Lana's room. But tonight, he'd moved some of her things to make space for new memories. Photos of Peter at his first university class. A copy of the foundation paperwork. A thank you card from Samuel. I'm doing it, so he said to the quiet. I'm trying. Not perfectly, but honestly. The room didn't answer. But the silence felt warm now, full of possibility instead of grief. He thought about Peter, about Samuel, about the investors he'd almost let destroy him, about how one boy's courage had taught him to listen, how speaking up had changed 3 lives. Richard picked up his phone, started drafting the announcement for the Foundation's first scholarship class. With 20 kids, 20 chances, 20 voices that deserved to be heard. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a start. And sometimes that's all courage requires. Not perfection, just starting. Peter Ross fell asleep with the journal on his chest, dreaming of languages he hadn't learned yet, of students he'd meet, of ripples spreading wider than he could imagine. He'd spent 12 years learning to be invisible. One night taught him to be seen, and everything changed. Not because he was special, because he was brave, because he spoke up when silence would have been easier, because he refused to let fear win. The billionaire had laughed, but the boy spoke anyway, and that made all the difference.